Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us. Ray's Latino Talk Show. This is politics. We talk politics and what's impacting the Latino community from the streets. I like to say de la calle. And, you know, when you're having these kind of conversations about what's going on in politics, this very special Mother's Day edition honoring our madres out there, both in the States and throughout Latin America and throughout the world. You got to have that West Coast flavor in the building, so we wanted to bring on a great friend to the show that's so overdue, political strategist and activist, and a great friend to the show, and a big Dodger fan. I won't hold that against him. Danny Montes. Danny, finally, welcome to Ray's Talk Show.
How's it going, man? It's glad I finally got on.
No, it's overdue, and we're really happy to have you on the show. And again, we're going to talk. We have a lot to talk about here. Danny has some particular expertise in the area of criminal justice reform. He's currently working for. Let me bring up your extensive bio here. Californians for Safety and Justice, an organization focused on shifting the way our justice system impacts our community. And I've got the latest study from the National Council of La Raza that I want to share around those issues, particularly around how Latinos feel about the use of body-worn cameras, and in general, their attitudes towards the police and policing in their community. But Danny has a lot of expertise in the area, has worked on various campaign and organizing work in areas like higher education, labor, health, and immigration. So he brings a lot to the table, and we're going to talk about a variety of issues. Obviously, the latest headlines. I want to get Danny's thoughts on what he just thinks about this crazy time period between ACA repeal, the Comey scandal, and everything that's happening in Washington. Of course, pick Danny's brain about sort of the state of where Latinos are at as it relates to our relationship with the criminal justice system, and that has a very strong immigrant lens, and the safety and the civil rights of our immigrant community, regardless of their documented status, and that's a very acute issue in California. And we're going to honor our mothers. Both Danny and I are going to share a moment talking about the biggest inspirations in our lives, the mothers alive, and much respect to all the women listening to the show and all the mothers listening to the show that not only take care of their families, but also are really as I like to say, take care of everybody in the community. So, Danny, let people know where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, people could find out just sort of what's going on with me or sort of the worlds around criminal justice and the impact of immigrants on my Twitter, at Danny also on Twitter, DANNYOSO.
And as we shared earlier, this set of podcast episodes are being brought to you by Planned Parenthood and the I Defy campaign. Check out hashtag I Defy for more information about what Planned Parenthood is going about. You know, we invite all of you to join Planned Parenthood in their I Defy campaign and send a message that we will defy hate and discrimination, all of its forms, reproductive rights or human rights. This fight isn't over. Extremists want to shut down health centers, cut off millions, really billions of dollars that provide valuable access to young people, working people, many women, many Latinas around the country, millions of people that are provided healthcare access, birth control access because of Planned Parenthood. Pledging to defy means committing to stay loud, stay strong, and defend what we love. Defend the efforts to defund Planned Parenthood by texting TALK to 22422. That's texting TALK, the word TALK, to 22422. Stay loud, get loud, defy today. Again, text TALK to 22422. I know, Danny, Planned Parenthood is a big part of our progressive coalition in California as well.
Absolutely.
For sure. So, first of all, Danny Montes, you're based out in California, La Buena Vida, and oftentimes those folks outside of the West Coast think that, it's a very progressive state. They're almost those Californians are kind of almost protected from the bubble. So please share with us your perspective on the first, where we're at here with the Trump administration and California's perspective on these issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think some of our leaders here in California have been very vocal as it relates to sort of the resistance against the Trump administration. Working here, I would say that it's not all paradise. There's still a lot of work. There's still a lot of pushback. There's still a lot of resistance to sort of moving the work forward, even at the local level. And I think, as much as we want to be the leader and pushing forward and pushing these progressive policies and agendas, the reality is that this administration at the federal level, has made a lot of threats, has made a lot of, you know, insinuating that, if you go against the Trump administration, we're going to cut funding. And that has had a really chilling effect as it relates to how the state and local governments move forward. Especially, I mean, we'll get into it later, but just sort of the ACA implementation and sort of that, the fact that we are even talking about potentially repealing that has made many people very weary on moving forward to providing coverage and thinking outside the box on how do we provide coverage for everybody.
Yeah, I'm curious. What do you guys think? I mean, know that a handful of Republican Congress people who were part of all of our target list to try to vote against the ACA bill, which I've called on the show CACA many times. Daryl Issa, Devin Nunes, Valadao, some of those folks in Central California, but Issa's in the LA area. What's the thought about? I know you're disappointed that they voted for the act, but what are people's thoughts about energizing to target those folks next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's taught us that we need to pay a lot more attention to local politics, and Trump is sort of moving forward, bulldozing through his agenda, but there are systems in place, right? We do have Congress, we do have a House of Representatives, we do have senators, and for many of us in these communities, and some of these Republican Congress people represent areas where there's a huge amount of Latino community members, and so that's definitely something that people, organizations at the local level are keeping an eye on, holding them accountable, figuring out how do we have meetings, town halls with these individuals to let them know that this is not okay, right? And that we are paying attention to the midterm elections. We are paying attention to the decisions and the activity and inactivity that they're having as these conversations, whether it's tax reform, whether it's, these hearings that are happening with the FBI and Sally Yates, ACA repeal, whatever it may be, people are starting to pay attention. And that's something that in California we're definitely seeing people move in that direction, which for me is providing that hope. Where sometimes we may not necessarily feel it as we're hearing all these news cycles day by day of the horrible things happening.
Whether it's interesting because when we think about like healthcare, for example, so much of this ties into our feelings of a lack of security, a lack of safety. And I think about, the things that we pushed back on in California a generation ago related to, anti-immigrant laws that really sort of, looking back on it, sort of changed California politics for a generation. There used to be Republicans. They used to win statewide elections in California. That with a few, unless you're a Hollywood celebrity, that doesn't happen anymore. And that's because the Latino community woke up. And I think now about SB4 being signed in law in Texas by Greg Abbott is shameful. Signing it on a Sunday, a day of prayer and reflection and family, which basically put a target on every Latino's back in the state of Texas, which we're over 40% of the population and 20% of the Latino community nationwide. And just thinking about, this immigrants being targeted, how that then spills over into the targeting of the larger Latino community, the insecurity, both health and financial, that is placed on people that their healthcare access and health insurance is in jeopardy, and just the ongoing targeting of immigrants by the federal government. It just kind of creates, it creates, Danny, this people I just think underestimate how much stress that our community across the board feels when these policies are not are being either threatened or, in the case of SB4, begun to be implemented.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I heard about this SB4 and, I heard the governor's speech about how sanctuary cities are deadly consequences, the first thing I thought was like, man, this might be the biggest alternative fact we've heard in a while. And, because some Republicans and a lot of anti-immigrant voices love to find that one story, that one murder case, that one sort of situation, and use that to push an agenda that they want, right? And, it's instead of focusing on the root causes of why some of these crimes exist, they're creating blanket policies that horribly impact the sector of society. As you mentioned, I work in the area of criminal justice, and I work with a lot of community groups, a lot of community members, lawyers, faith leaders, and just the sheer stories that I've heard these last couple of months regarding ICE and the ICE agency and sort of how they're freely walking the halls in the courtrooms. In Bakersfield, I heard that there was ICE agents going into a Starbucks and asking for people's identification. There's educators that told me that ICE agents aren't on school property, but they're right across the street. And so we are creating this environment where, ICE, which is probably the least accountable regulated agency, law enforcement agency, have full access to these communities. They're creating terror. They're creating a lot of fear. And, even though, I will say that some of the local law enforcement, LAPD, has, done a good job at trying to connect with the community and letting them know that, they don't necessarily agree with a lot of the ICE policies and that, people should still feel safe to contact them if anything happens. But, where I grew up, like, if the police are knocking on your door, it doesn't matter if it's a blue uniform, black uniform, purple uniform, whatever it is, it's still law enforcement, and it still creates that fear. And so, because of this, it's creating this environment where not only are we fearful to leave our homes for schools, for coffee, to engage with other sectors of society, but we are also creating a sentiment of fear to report crimes, right? And that drastically impacts public safety. If I'm afraid to call my local police when I see a crime, when I see domestic violence, when I see a situation because of the consequences that it may cause to me, that doesn't make us safe, right? That is not public safety. And sanctuary cities is a way to ensure that when these type of things happen, that people feel safe in their own communities to live, right? So to hear this coming out of the governor of Texas about like this is these are deadly consequences. It's not. It's a way to counter these horrible approaches at the federal level that are drastically impacting immigrants across the country, not just in California.
No, and you're talking about, it's almost like we have all these layers of of law enforcement targeting us, whether it's ICE and then of course your standard police force. And I know that's a big focus of your work, Danny, and you listen to Danny Montes, activist, or a political organizer and analyst from California, great friend of the show. Very overdue that he's been on the show. And again, this episode of Raise Latino Talk podcast is being sponsored by the Planned Parenthood as part of the I Defy campaign, hashtag I Defy. Defy the efforts to defund Planned Parenthood by texting TALK to 22422. That's text TALK to 22422. Get loud, stay loud, Defy today. And we'll talk a little bit about my family's history with Planned Parenthood when we talk about the mothers not live later in the show. So Danny, it's interesting because one of the things I often talk about is the fact that, with the rash over the last several years of these very shocking, sad, troubling videos of, basically black men being killed by police in very questionable circumstances. And this idea of Black Lives Matter and this renewal of the discussion around the relationship between police and the black community and minority communities is that one of the things that's frustrating to me is that absolutely we need to bring up those issues and support the Black Lives Matter movement. But that similar cases and similar issues in Latino communities, even when we have salacious videos, often just don't get reported. A lot of that happens in California, frankly, in terms of, especially when you talk about San Bernardino and that part of the country in the Central Valley. Kern County, California's had lots of issues. I mean, that senior citizen that got killed about 6 months ago for wandering onto somebody's lawn, in the middle of the night, just sort of in a dazed state. And there's been lots of incidents with young men and women. Think about that incident in Orange County where, the off-duty cop shot a gun up in the air because some minority kids were just running around his lawn. There's lots of issues in California. So talk a little bit about some of the issues you're dealing with and why we need to elevate the conversation of the relationship between the criminal justice system and the Latino community as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So before I get to that, I do want to talk about sort of where we were before we started doing this work, right? In for the last couple of decades, we've been really heavy on war on crime, war on poverty, and we created this sort of environment and society where we heavily incarcerated individuals, right? We created mandatory sentences, we created enhancements, slapping felonies on people, and in California, I mean, and you mentioned about a couple of 20 years ago, there was a huge attack on the immigrant communities, right? And there was a lot of propositions and stuff that was passed. I remember in middle school growing up and seeing ads around super predators, right? And how these super predators are going to hunt and kill and murder our kids. And then when I would understand it now, looking back, they were talking about me. They were talking about Danny in 8th grade, right? And because I came from an immigrant household, because I lived in a poor community, I was automatically determined as I'm going to be, if I'm not already, a super predator. And so one of the things that we did in 2011 was we said that enough is enough, right? We are incarcerating our youth, we're incarcerating our individuals, we're creating this environment where having health problems such as addiction is criminalized. And we work together, and that's where the birth of Californians for Safety and Justice happened, where we realized we need a shift. We need to pivot away from spending so much of our money into incarceration and focus on things that work, right? Focus on prevention, focus on rehabilitation, on re-entry, on providing people hope, redemption, a second chance. And one of the things that I don't know if you know, but having a felony in the state of California, you already have 4,800 restrictions on you, and majority of those, about half, are all employment based, right? So if you have a felony on your record, you serve your time, and you go back into the community, that is what you're facing. You're facing 4,800 restrictions on you.
They don't have you don't, Danny. What's the state? They don't have ban the box in the California policy.
Yeah, so and I think that's where a lot of these changes happen. We do have ban the box. We have actually a couple more bills happening now that focus on the second chances.
Why don't you? I'm sorry. Explain to people quickly what ban the box is.
Ban the box is so when somebody goes to get a job, they are in the application process. Many times they ask, "Have you ever been convicted of a crime?" And for a lot of the people who have, they mark that, and so as they're getting that's how sometimes they're judged before they even look at an individual's qualifications, before they even go into an interview. They're being judged by a crime they committed or that they were convicted of, I would say, of an offense that they were convicted of before you could even talk about it. And so for us, we saw that, and for the community here, we realized that type of discrimination is going to ensure that people who are trying to get back on their feet, who are trying to rehabilitate, they're already being judged. And so imagine, you coming out and want to be a better person and get a job, and realizing that everybody is judging you based on that one thing that you did, not on the qualifications. And so we Ban the Box is an initiative, and it's happening, across the state. And there's been different conversations around eliminating that box, right? That box asking you whether you've ever been convicted of an offense, to ensure that if an individual is, to make sure that they're viewed based on their qualifications, right? If that job needs some type of background check, or if that's something that they need to know, ask that later in the application process, not have that be the determinant on whether they even get an opportunity for an interview.
Yeah, no, and even before we even get to sort of reintegrating felon people, reintegrating people that have been has served time in incarcerated, and those issues, right? There's this relationship with the police force, how we view what's the role of law enforcement, what's supposed to be the role of law enforcement, their lack of understanding of our community. I mean, even before, and this is why the anti-immigrant rhetoric just ratchets up this fear. Because again, in the case of SB 1070 in Arizona and SB 4 in Texas now that we're fighting legally, it essentially, when you create these sort of policies, particularly those two policies, and essentially legalize racial profiling, it just creates a level of not only increasing incarceration rates in our community, but also this level of stress, which has health implications, and also, has implications how we're going to cooperate with the police in our community. So we're in this. It's interesting because I'm looking at referencing the National Council of Raza's recent report, Policing and Body-Worn Cameras, Perspectives from the Latino Community. I'm going to read a couple quotes here, Danny, and you tell me how this resonates with the work you've done with young people in California. So this is a Latino adult from Washington, D.C. So we're stuck in this middle situation where some of us live in communities that aren't safe. But at the same time, I don't feel comfortable calling a police officer. Another quote here: we have the police don't understand and are trained to engage with us through our problems of poverty. They don't understand what it is, what we're going through in our community. They don't get enough training on how to work with poor people, those of us who are disenfranchised. That's from a Chicago activist. So there's also a lot of sentiment from these focus groups that took place with Latino communities around the country that police aren't given the proper, police are not psychiatrists. And so police are not provided enough mental health for themselves or enough of a sort of a psychological, culturally competent training how to engage our communities, whether that's from an immigrant lens. There's literal language barriers oftentimes in these interactions. And just understanding culturally, we've gone through this, right, Danny, where when cops have often said, well, the person, the Latino's not looking directly in our eyes was a cause of disrespect. Where in the Latino community, oftentimes our parents' you don't look people in the eye because that's too, it's actually disrespectful. So those kind of little cultural nuances can create this trust and this lack of understanding. So Danny, from these, do the comments from these focus groups that NCLR had recently, does that resonate with the communities that you work in and the kind of policies that you try to create, advocate for in California?
No, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned how police and law enforcement are not psychiatrists. And I don't think we should treat them that way. I don't think have law enforcement be healthcare providers, right? Let's have healthcare providers be healthcare providers. Let's build these partnerships. Let's create some of these diversion programs. Let's treat health problems with health solutions, and not sort of have law enforcement be sort of given that task. And I say this because it's a huge issue because, a lot of the times law enforcement gets a lot of funding to do this type of work. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people that get re-victimized and get triggered by having to go get services within a law enforcement building. And so for us, we're trying to figure out, and the work that we do is figuring out what are some of the partnerships at the local level that we can have with law enforcement to ensure that if people need help, if people need some type of treatment, that they do get it, and have law enforcement resources be focused more on public safety rather than expecting them to do so much. Because I will tell you that is a lot of stress on law enforcement, and they also get traumatized and they also get triggered, and so sometimes when they're in the moment, because they have so much and because they're expected to do so much, their rationale or quick thinking isn't the best. And, we've seen what happens when that's the situation.
And you're listening to Danny Montes, an activist, among other things, that's really engaged in criminal justice reform and those sort of issues related to the Latino community in California. And Danny has a lot of friends in D.C. and throughout the country. He's really a national leader, and we're happy to have Danny on the show. Danny, remind people one last time where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at DannyOso, DANNYOSO.
Absolutely. We could talk about this, and we're going to have Danny back and really get into it with, because the flip side of this, Danny, with this conversation around criminal justice and the Latino community's relationship with the police, being a cop in our community is a pretty esteemed profession. We're very proud, even though we have these issues, and we want to bridge stronger gaps with build stronger coalitions between law enforcement and our community. We know that the vast majority particularly Latino law enforcement, but law enforcement around the country are good people trying to do the right thing, and oftentimes just need more resources and actually better policies. We know a lot of police officers don't want to deal with. Most police officers don't want to deal with being involved in immigration enforcement for sure. So oftentimes these policies are actually putting an undue burden on our police officers. And again, hey, oftentimes the cousin, the tío, the sister that's in law enforcement or the military is someone that's held in very high regard in our community. So these are conversations happening in a context of we want these relationships to be stronger and we honor the work that they do. Danny wanted to talk about our moms. This is people are going to hear this. This will be the episode that gets released going into Mother's Day weekend. And there's no group of people that are more valued in our world, and particularly in the Latino community, than our madres. I know, Danny, you wanted to just share, show off to people and honor for a moment your dear mother.
No, and I appreciate sort of the space that we're creating on this. And so actually, I was talking to somebody yesterday about just my mom and some of the memories growing up, and it really triggered like how much of an impact my mom has had. And just so you know, my mom came from a small rural rancho in Zacatecas, Mexico with my dad at a very young age, had me at a very young age, and like I think early 20s. And in the community that they grew up, they had the highest form of education that they could get was 6th grade. And they wanted to come to the United States to ensure that they could grow a family, that their, kids could eventually flourish and do whatever they wanted to do. And, growing up, I didn't really notice this at the time, but, my mom was undocumented for the first few years of my life.
Oh, wow.
And during that time, obviously, this is the Governor Pete Wilson era, right, where we're directly attacking immigrant families. And so that, this didn't start with Trump. I'll tell you that. Like, this is something that our communities have consistently been
decades, absolutely,
and forced to deal with. And so, looking back now, that was what my mom was facing. But even in those difficult times, she still had the courage and the fearlessness to stand up and represent for myself. Like, I'll give you some examples. Like, growing up, I used to have really good grades in elementary school, and there was opportunities for me to take sort of honors classes. And at that time, the school and my teachers refused to put me in those classes because they knew that nobody in my household spoke English. And that was the only reason why. And so I remember going into those school meetings where my mom was very, very assertive and vigilant and told them, like, that should not be a determinant. She's like, he needs help. I'm going to find that help for him, or I'll figure it out. But you shouldn't base that, or you shouldn't judge it. And, growing up, I also loved, like, the performing arts. In elementary school, I used to be in a bunch of plays, and she would go to them. She would help me, practice my lines. In my teen years, I grew up and I did a lot of martial arts, and for years I studied Shaolin Kung Fu, and I eventually got my black belt. And that was literally years of every Tuesday and every Thursday going to practice, getting, learning and all that stuff. And every single class, my mom was there. We didn't have money for a car, so we walked there, walked back, and whether it was her just sitting there sewing, talking to other parents, she was always there. And
that's beautiful.
She taught me, never to be mean to people or never to talk down people. Always have the respect and courtesy, even at the face of adversity. And so, for me, thinking about Mother's Day and sort of the impact that she had, she also taught me not to be a punk, right? Like, stand up for myself when I need to stand up for myself. But it's really great to really think and be privileged to have somebody like my mom who was there for me, who fought for me. She's my everything. So I want to just say thank you, Margarita Montes, for being such a special person in my life.
Oh, that's beautiful. And my when I think about everything my mother went through, I was asking my mother the other day, she, the long and short of it is that she left. She was a college student in Puerto Rico at the time, and she decided for family reasons to come to the mainland United States. We were American citizens, of course, of Puerto Rico, and she came by herself. She's one of 11 siblings. Thank God, 10 of the 11 are still alive. I got dozens of cousins and everything else, but she came alone, and the courage she had to leave her family, her extended family, to come to Philadelphia in the late '60s, to path her own to carve her own path for herself was really amazing. And it turns out I found actually fairly recently that her first job in Philadelphia was working at a satellite Planned Parenthood clinic in the at the time a very relatively small Latino community in Philadelphia in the early '70s, but a community that needed that kind of culturally competent assistance. And at the time, a very Spanish dominant, mostly Puerto Rican, newly arrived Puerto Rican community. And so, she's just always been there for everybody, was a city employee working on neighborhood dispute mediation for 30 years, very active in church, very active in community issues, issues of women, people of color, young people, people of faith, and always supportive of everything I've ever done. I certainly wouldn't have gone to, and I've been blessed to go to Catholic school, which was not a small thing financially in those days, still isn't, and higher education. I think she's probably helping me still pay for that stuff. And never complained about anything through divorce, through the ups and downs of life. Has just always been grateful for what she's had, and taught us to, that social justice, even though she didn't couch it in those real political terms, social through our faith was really the core of our lives. And so, Sonia Collazo, I honor you so much. I talk about my mommy all the time on the show, and we can't spend enough time honoring the women and the mothers of our lives. Of course, my wife, who's a wonderful mother in her own right, Michelle Collazo, and all the mothers out there, and we really appreciate everything that they do for us. And again, our social justice bent for people like Danny and myself really comes from the values that our mothers taught us in our lives. Danny, we've got to wrap up this episode of Raise Latino Talk podcast. Anything else you'd like to share? I know you got amped for the Sally Yates testimony, and I know you're really curious about the next moves that happen here at Washington after the Comey firing, and there's always stuff happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave with this. I think there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of real fear in our communities and in the work that we do. And it doesn't help that we have this type of president who is rather burning bridges rather than building them. But I was really impressed at Sally Yates in a way where
she's the bomb, man.
Grace under fire, she was exemplified what it meant to be a public servant. And for me, I got politicized during the Bush administration, right? And we're talking about war on terror, the wars, Hurricane Katrina, all of that stuff. That really made me sort of realize that this is what I'm doing now is what I wanted to do. And so even though we live in fear and hopelessness, the younger generation, this is what they're seeing, and they're realizing that this is not okay, and they're doing something about it, and we're being really creative. I'll just say one of my favorite movies last year was Rogue One from Star Wars, and one of the lines was that rebellions are built on hope. And I felt like Sally Yates's testimony was a glimmer of hope that we could carry within ourselves to model that and be those public servants and face these adversities during these difficult times. I definitely want to be much more optimistic than a lot of people, but I think we're not going to solve these issues tomorrow. We're not going to solve them next week. It may take a while, but I 100% believe that we're going to get there, and we're getting people to really understand the implications that some of these policies are having in our communities to ensure that we do better.
And you know why it's going to happen, and it's going to make us stronger ultimately, even though unfortunately a lot of us will suffer, depending on the extent that these policies are implemented over the next few years, is that, because it's the Margaritas and the Sonias of this country, the real people that make this country what it is. And, we oftentimes, and because of the reality of the power that the president has and this administration has over many things in this country, we get so caught up in the anxiety of the scourge of this presidency, and to a large degree also the lack of leadership of our members of Congress, particularly on the Ryan congressional side. But that, ultimately, we've got tens of millions, hundreds of millions of wonderful people in this country that want to do the right thing, that want to build bridges and unify. And some of us may feel insecure and lash out in ways that are unhealthy politically, but the reality is that they need to be supported as well. So you're absolutely right, Danny. And when we have more time, next time you come on, we'll talk about your Dodgers. I know you got some young boys. I know you're rubbing in another generation of great Dodger players. As a Phillies fan, I'm on decade 4 dealing with that reality. Even though we had a couple of good playoff series against you in the late 2000s, but nevertheless, Seager and I know you got a bunch of young studs. Jock Peterson is learning the strike zone, and even Yasiel Puig is contributing a little bit. It probably should be more, but it should be a little bit. But hey, we really appreciate it. And again, we want to thank Planned Parenthood, who sponsored this episode of Ray's Latino Talk podcast. Support their Defy campaign, hashtag Defy. And again, text TALK to 22422. Defy the efforts to defund Planned Parenthood by texting TALK to 22422. Danny Montes, always a pleasure, brother. Give my best to all our some Philly love to my Cali people. And you'll be on the show again very soon. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.